It's good to see all of you tonight. Thank you for being here. We got several visitors with us tonight, but I think we also got a lot of people that just came home. So thank you for being here as well. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Acts 24. This is when Paul has been arrested by the Romans because the Jews tried to kill him, claiming he had brought a Gentile into the temple. And now he's appearing before the governor. The Sanhedrin has hired a fancy lawyer to go appeal to the governor to have Paul prosecuted or put in trouble or something like that, like he's been stirring up problems. And we're about to read what the lawyer is going to call Christianity. He's going to refer to Christianity as a sect of the Nazarenes, which I think is very interesting. Before we read the reading, though, kind of puts you in a setting. I've always, or at least I have specific memories of struggling to answer when people ask me what I believed, what church do I go to, what are you affiliated with? It was always a struggle. And many of you have heard this story, but I remember being in 5th grade specifically and taking the Alabama SAT, where they make elementary school kids take. And their first page is all this identification information, right? And you're supposed to put your name, supposed to put your race, your gender, and then even your religious affiliation. I remember in 5th grade specifically, it took me forever to get to the questions actually in the SAT because I was sweating on the identification page. The first thing I was sweating about is race. Because if y'all remember, there was no white bubble in that thing. There was only Caucasian, and I had no idea what a Caucasian was. And so I would always I think I finally decided that I just did other, and I wrote white. And I had no idea what I was doing. The next problem I had was the religious affiliation. And by the way, everybody else is on question, 30. I'm still on the ID page. And you got a list of different denominations there, and somewhere near the bottom, definitely not near the top, says Church of Christ. And I'm thinking in 5th grade, do I bubble that in? I don't know. Because I think I know what that means, but I don't think they know what that means. And I'm sitting there thinking about whether I'm going to bubble in Church of Christ or not, which is why I'm a preacher now and didn't go into the professional world, because I didn't take the test. But certainly there, I think at the end, I finally just put other, and I put Christian on there, and so probably just got discarded because they didn't know what to do with that. But I think many of you have faced that issue as well before in different settings, and I don't feel like I really found a very good answer or kind of like a plan set answer when I was asked that question until I was much older in my 20s. In Acts 24, Paul, I think, gives us a very good perspective of that, but not necessarily talking about Christianity being a different denomination in Christianity, but actually the Jews here trying to make Christianity a denomination or a sect in Judaism. If you see here what the lawyer says, Tertullius, and if I start here up in verse 3, he says, "We accept it always in the places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Right? He accuses Paul of being the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. This guy has even named Christianity. He's given it a label. And you could understand why they would come up with the idea that it's a sect of the Nazarenes. Why? Because where was Jesus from? He was Jesus of Nazareth. And so they've even tried to label this sect, right? But what's Paul's answer here? Let's look down here to verse 14. This is now Paul speaking. Let me start in verse 12. "And they neither found me in the temple disrupting anyone or inciting the crowd, either the synagogue of the city, nor can they prove of the things which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men." That's a wonderful answer. It even says, I'm being judged now according to the way, which is all caps in the New King James, but it seems like that's what the early Christians referred to as Christianity, They just called it the way. And what are, of course, they referencing? They're referencing Jesus' very famous line, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that's what they called the religion they were a part of. But he says, but what I call the way, what do the Jews call? They call it a sect or a section. And Paul rejects that. He says, no, what you'll find me to be a believer of is a person who has hope in God, a person who believes in the resurrection, and of course, obviously, a person that believes in Jesus Christ. And so if I sort of take this apart, what I see here is that Paul just completely rejects the model that's put before him. And he doesn't try to conform to the model, but he completely rejects it. The Judaism here, it seems like what they've tried to do is they've just tried to incorporate Christianity into their own sect or denominational system. And we know a lot of the names of the different denominations in Judaism in the first century. What were their names? Well, of course, they're trying to incorporate the way in here, but we know about the Pharisees, that they were, a sect, or we could say a denomination, which is the same meaning of the word. Denomination is just denominable of a larger whole, like $1 is a denomination of $100, or this is a section of the whole, the Pharisees, a sect. The Pharisees had a certain group of beliefs. They had their own leadership. They had their own synagogues. They believed in the resurrection. They kind of set themselves apart from the other sects in Judaism. We know about the Essenes that the Bible speaks about, but not much. And of course, the other big one was the Sadducees. What are all these? Well, these are all sects. In their mind, you put them all together, well, that's what Judaism is made up of. All these different belief systems. What's funny is most of these people couldn't even sit in the same room together. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, and they only believed in the first 5 books of Moses, whereas the Pharisees believed in the whole canon. So they didn't get along. They never got along. The only thing they ever got along with was to go murder Jesus together that one night. That's really the only thing they've ever gotten along with. But you can see how when Christianity comes to be, what do they try to do to Christianity? Well, they don't say it's its own thing. They say it's a sect of Judaism. Where, okay, y'all want to be Christians, y'all want to be the sect of the Nazarenes, no problem. We'll cut you a piece of pie of Judaism, and you will just be incorporated into Judaism. And for all I know, it seems like the Sanhedrin may have eventually been okay in their mind with the Christians one day joining the Sanhedrin and just being another block in the Sanhedrin council. Well, these people represent the Jesus people. But how does Paul feel about that model? Paul completely rejects the model. He says, no, this is the way. They call it a sect, but this is Christianity, and it's its own thing. Is it a section of something bigger? Is it a denomination of something bigger? No, it's its own thing. And I think that's displayed very well in 2 different passages. You might want to keep a marker in Acts, but I want to go to Galatians chapter 2. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul, Barnabas, and Titus come home to Jerusalem. Titus, being a Gentile, is compelled by some of the brethren, quotation marks there, to be circumcised. And Paul refuses for it to be happen. If you look in chapter 2, starting in verse 2, it says, and I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those who are of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren, secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we may not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. There's a lot to unpack there, but let's just start at the beginning there. Verse 3, Titus was a Gentile. He was a Greek. Of course, he was uncircumcised. When the Jews meet Titus, and some of them trying to incorporate him into what they're already doing, they convince Titus or try to convince him to be circumcised. That's kind of strange because you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. You don't have to follow the old law to be saved. And so that really breaks the whole doctrine of what Paul's been teaching all during the first missionary journey, teaching that Gentiles could be saved just by being baptized and obeying the gospel. And so Paul, how does he feel about this? Well, he says some ugly things about him in verse 4. He says, these weren't brethren, these were false brethren. That seemed like they had an agenda, which was just to secretly spy out our liberties in Christ and bring us back into bondage. What are they trying to bring Titus and Paul into bondage of? Well, they're trying to bring them into bondage of the old law. And I would even go a step further. They're also trying to bring them into bondage into this, right? The idea being that if they can get Titus to be circumcised, and they can convince other Gentiles like him to be circumcised, what argument do these Jewish Christians have now? Well, these Jewish Christians can now argue that all these Gentiles that now go to church with them, well, they're just all proselytes, and you can see a really world situation happening where, your mom, who's a good Jewish woman, and you're now a Christian, and she's fussing at you about going to that place on Sunday and sitting in a room with all those Gentiles. What nice little clever argument can you say back now? Well, you can say, Mom, don't worry about it. They're all circumcised in there. They're all proselytes. Mom, I'm still doing what I've always been doing. I'm still a Jew. I've just joined a different denomination, right? That's sort of the whole argument behind the Judaizing teachers. That's the benefit. It helps you escape persecution is what it does. And so now you get to say, well, I'm just playing ball in the model. I've joined this different denomination, but I'm still a Jew. Why? Because all the people around me are still practicing the old law. They're still practicing circumcision. That's good news. Paul says that's terrible news. What does Paul do to those people? He says, I did not yield even for an hour. It's almost as if, I don't think it took him a whole hour. It's almost as if someone suggested it and immediately Paul slapped it down. And he said, we're not doing that. We're not doing that at all. And he says the reason why is so that the truth of the gospel might continue with you, talking to these Gentile Galatians he's writing to. Propose a situation where Paul did allow Titus to be circumcised. What would have the confusion that Paul would have brought about if he allowed Titus to be circumcised? Well, he would have allowed an argument to be made that all Christianity was another denomination of Judaism and not its own thing. That's why he could not yield. He had to allow the truth of the gospel to continue, which is that the way is its own thing. It is not a sect of Judaism. And that's why it's important he did. Now, what's the next question people ask about Titus's? Little story here. We all immediately jump to an Acts when Timothy was circumcised. There's an easy answer as to why Timothy was circumcised and Titus was not. The easy answer is Timothy was a Jew. That's why he was circumcised. That's the answer. His mother was Jewish. He had never been circumcised. And there would be kind of an argument saying, why was this guy never circumcised? He is a Jew. Well, Titus, is he a Jew? No, he's a Gentile. He has no reason, traditional or not, to be circumcised. And that's why a point need to be made that Titus need not be circumcised to prove again that they are not part of the denomination of Judaism. And it kind of makes a point right there of a sense of application. If we are trying to stand out and be different, and we are actually trying to say, look, we are different than the rest of the religious world. We believe we're our own thing here. We're part of the universal church. Are there going to be times where we're going to need to stand up and draw a line and say, hey, look, we are distinctly different? Yeah. Should we ever yield to submission to those things, or do we need to be distinctly different? I think Paul shows us here there are times we need to be distinctly different, because how are they going to see it's its own thing unless we are distinctly different? Let's turn back to Acts 15. And personally, I believe that Acts 15 is happening at the same time Galatians 2 is. But regardless, you can see here in Acts 15, the Pharisees that were arguing that Christian Gentiles needed to be circumcised to be saved, they're still referring to themselves as Pharisees, which I find to be sort of scary, but also interesting. In Acts 15, here at the Jerusalem Council, this again after the first missionary journey, Paul has converted all these Gentiles. And if we just start here backwards in verse 4, it says, and when they had come to Jerusalem, that's Paul and Barnabas, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that God had done with them. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up, saying it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. We know what the problem is. The problem is that it is necessary to circumcise them and keep the law of Moses. That's just not true. But that I thought was interesting was the way Luke talks about these brethren. He doesn't call them false brethren like Paul does in Galatians 2, but what does he call them at the top of verse 5? He says, but those, some of the sect of the Pharisees. In the first century, there were Christians among them in Jerusalem, and what were they still calling themselves, even though they had become Christians? They were still calling themselves Pharisees. That's kind of strange. You know, you would think, and I know Paul uses an argument later, and we're going to read that you would think that if once you've obeyed the gospel, you would put all the Judaism things behind you and say, no, what are you? What do you believe? You say, I'm a member of the way. But what were evidently these people saying? Well, they were a member of the way, but they were also part of the sect of the Pharisees. Can you see the issue? It's almost as if this group of people, even though they were enjoying the blessings of being members of the church, they still wanted to hold on to that old model. And that's the issue I think a lot of us can resonate with. One of the issues that we have when people ask what we are and what we do, it is our own brethren giving very confusing answers. And then that goes on and they'll circle around to other brethren and they'll make it even more confusing. And now people already have their own ideas about what we're doing here and we haven't even talked to them yet. How many times have we been told, you know, where do you go to church? I'll go to so-and-so Church of Christ. And they respond with, oh, y'all are the only ones y'all are going to heaven, right? And I'm like, who told you that? Well, they don't even know who told them that, right? That's just what you're supposed to say when you hear the phrase Church of Christ. Well, the issue, I think, right there with that statement is a confusion of what we're all about here. Because when we're in a hot spot and someone says a question like that, and they kind of push you and say, well, where do you go to church? What denomination are you a part of? And you say Church of Christ. Unintentionally, maybe, what have you endorsed? You've endorsed the model, right? You know, when they pose the question, like, where do I put your section on the piece of pie? And you give them an answer that looks like a piece of pie, you've endorsed the model. And they go, oh, okay, I got you. And they move on with their life, again, confused. And let's face it, there's a lot of brethren, of people that I do consider to be brethren. And they have a denominational mindset about what we're doing here. And they think that they're part of the Church of Christ denomination, and they'll tell other people about that. But that sort of goes back to Paul here. Paul didn't believe that. Paul believed that we were doing our own thing that did not have any sections to it. And again, that's all very problematic, right? When I was 25, I felt like I finally had a better answer to this question. And probably Paul was a big help for that. I remember being at UAB and sitting at Al's. And you know, I love that sweet tea with the men in it. I think that was a win decision. And I have a lot of buddies that are in history class together. We are talking about religion. It's easier to talk about religion with them because we're all kind of open about it. And they're literally going around the table asking each other what denomination they're a part of. And they'll tell you, I'm part of this denomination. I'm part of this denomination. We were talking about the difference between Catholic and Protestant. We're going around and around and around. It finally gets to me. Well, Andrew is not in 5th grade anymore. And I got a better answer. And my answer was something like this. I said, where I go to church has Church of Christ on the sign. But if you want to understand what I'm affiliated with, I'll tell you this. I'm a Protestant's Protestant. I protest the Protestants. You're not going to be able to put me in a model. And I said, ultimately, there are not 2 churches of Christ you can go to that are exactly the same. It's not like there's some kind of organization that's controlling us, telling us what to do. We're all sort of independent groups. And there are places that have Church of Christ on the sign that I wouldn't feel comfortable attending with because of the things that they believe and practice. So I said, ultimately, the things you've heard about the Church of Christ is really us just trying to explain this maybe pretty poorly, which is one of our core tenets or core beliefs is we have rejected this model. We think this model's wrong. The church should not be broke into sections. And the church is not supposed to be divided into different core beliefs. Because aren't we all supposed to believe in the same New Testament. And that's sort of how we feel about that. And they all looked at me and they said, okay, next. You know, it's a long explanation, and I can get it. It's so much easier just to say, I'm Church of Christ, let's move on. But I feel like if we're going to be a distinct people and we're going to be like Paul and reject the model, then we actually got to take the time to reject the model, right? And Paul does us a good favor by rejecting the model here, either by what he does in Acts, but also what he does for Titus and Galatians 2. So let me propose 3 thoughts about this as we move forward, and I guess maybe 3 talking points we can use to talk about how we've rejected the model. I grew up being taught in school mostly, is that since we all love Jesus or we all care about the same Lord, none of the rest of it matters. But the problem is that even in the New Testament, there were people that all believed in the same Lord, like the Judaizing teachers, but the apostles were angry at them for what they were teaching, even though they still all believed in the same Lord. The doctrine itself matters. And we learned that very early in Galatians chapter 1. But the first thought I like to make about this is that the concept of sects or denominations, like we all are little parts of a whole, and it doesn't matter the little disagreements we have, or if you want to call them little disagreements, at least we're all claimed to be part of the same group, Judaism. That didn't even work for the Jews, and it's certainly not going to work for us. If you're still in Acts, look at chapter 23. This is right after Paul was arrested at the temple, and the Romans, not really knowing what to do with this guy, they take him to the Sanhedrin. And we already talked about the Sanhedrin is made up of these different sects. Verse 1, then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren, I have believed in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded that those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for as it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Just to pause for a moment. The high priest commands that Paul be struck across the face. Paul backtalks him, and then he apologizes and says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. Just Andrew's personal opinion on this. I have a hard time Paul didn't actually know that that guy sitting in the middle, probably in that fancy chair, was the high priest. What I think probably is going on here is that Paul is already in that statement dividing the group, because he knows he can divide the group, and as we're going to read in the next verse, he's going to begin dividing the group and turn them against one another. It seems to be what we know from the first century, thanks mainly to Josephus, that there was a guy who the Sadducees considered to be the high priest, and there was a guy that the Pharisees considered to be the real high priest. So when a Pharisee comes in there and looks at the Sadducee high priest and goes, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest, what is he doing? Well, he's already dividing the group, and maybe that's what Paul's doing here at the beginning. When you look at verse 6, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and Sadducees. The assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Maybe they're quoting Gamaliel from Acts 5. Verse 10, now there arose a great dissension. The commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the barracks. What a circus. You know, here we are here, and you've got to understand, sometime before Jesus was born, there was some decision made that like, look, we're all broken to these different sects. Why don't y'all send some guys from this sect, y'all send some guys from this sect, and let's all work together on this ruling council, and we'll run Israel together. Doesn't that seem like a great idea? Well, what are we doing here? You know, here's an easy target, by the way. It's Paul. He's a ringleader of this group that they all don't like. And what can they not even do? They can't even work together to get rid of Paul. And it becomes so violent when Paul says, look, this is about y'all's little denominational dispute, and I'm part of y'all, and I know y'all don't like it. The Roman commander, who has nothing to do with it, is so afraid that they're all about to get violent with each other that he just grabs Paul and runs. And that's the end of the story. Has sex ever worked for Judaism? Has denominations ever worked for Judaism? It never worked. It was always a problem. So isn't it interesting that just about 300 years later, the idea is, well, guys, maybe it'd be better if y'all do y'all's thing and we do our thing. And we just agree to disagree, but we'll still say that we're both, all believe in the same Lord. Well, it seems like we're just repeating history, doesn't it? And we can't agree on anything either. How problematic to accept a model and think that this model would actually work. Luke's very clear that the model doesn't work. Let's turn to James chapter 2 with me. I think we can make this as a talking point. There is enough divisions to overcome among us. We don't need to make more. There's enough. In James chapter 2, many of y'all know, we're talking about where people are sitting in the assembly and they're favoring the rich over the poor. Don't come sit by me, or please come and sit by me. James says this starting here in verse 8. Sorry, I'm looking at 1 Peter. James 2, starting here in verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. And really with the problem of who's sitting by me, or do I not want this person to sit by me, he says at the end of the day, you just need to follow the royal law of scripture, which is love your neighbor as yourself. If you show partiality, he's like, you're already in sin and you're convicted with the law of the transgressors. The solution here is in verse 12. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. That last line shouldn't be hard to understand. We escaped God's judgment because of God's mercy. Therefore, God's mercy is stronger than God's judgment, and we should live in such a manner. But I really want to key on here in verse 12. So speak and do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. Now, he says here the law of liberty. If you remember our reading already in Galatians 2, we talked about how the false brethren were trying to secretly spy out the liberty they had in Christ. What is this law of liberty? Well, it's a law. It's a law we're going to be judged by, but it is a law called the law of liberty. And I think it's because this law has freed us from several things. One thing that the law of liberty has freed us from is the old law, which I think is one of the things being discussed here in this little paragraph. I'm free from the law of Moses. I don't have to be circumcised to be saved. The other obvious thing it frees me from is sin. So the law of liberty gives me liberty from sin. I'm not a slave to sin anymore. Now I can be a servant to God. The other thing, which I think probably is what's in the context of the whole section, is it frees me or liberates me from the world and the world standards that they have put upon me, right? And how would that sort of work? Well, that would work with what we've just read about the rich man and the poor man. That would also work with what we could read in chapter 1, verse 9. Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, and let the rich brother glory in his humiliation. And I think the thought is that this church that God has created, it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor, or where you're from, or what you look like. What matters is that you are under the law of liberty. And we all find equality under the law of liberty. And so we're equals in that. And that's a wonderful thing. There's unity found there. Now, of course, the question would be this next. Does the law of liberty liberate us from the law of liberty? I don't know how it could. How could I be judged by the law of liberty here? I need to live like I'm somebody who's going to be judged by the law of the liberty. But I'm somehow liberated from the law of liberty? I think we're trying to have our cake and eat it too there. No, the concept is I'm going to be judged by the law of liberty. And of course, what would we call the law of liberty? we would call it the gospel. Just like in Romans, we are all going to be judged by the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, if we're already fighting divisions that the world puts on us, and we do have to fight those things. Let's just be honest. We got to fight class differences among brethren. We got to fight whatever the world says today needs to be the fight, right? And we have to deal with that in the church. We have to overcome those things. The one thing we should all be able to agree about is the perfect law of liberty. That's the only thing we should ever be able to agree about. If you decide, though, that, we can't agree about the law of liberty, we can't agree about what God says, let's break off into these different sects, and it'll all be okay, we'll accept it, but you can believe what you want to about the law of liberty, and I'll believe what I want to about the law of liberty. What have we done? We have broken the only thing we can find unification under. So we will never be unified, right? We've removed the one thing that we all can agree on. And I think that's why, and maybe this kind of comes as a personal opinion, and you can take it as a personal opinion. I think that's why, if you look at a lot of American denominations, they are broken up themselves in class differences. And maybe this is kind of something I don't want to say on the internet. I'll go back and wipe it if I need to. There is a type of person that goes to a Catholic church. There is a type of person that goes to a Presbyterian church. And you know what? They're usually a very different class difference than the type of person that goes to a Pentecostal church. Why is that? Well, they don't agree about the law of liberty. That's obvious. I think they would agree with that. They don't agree about doctrine. So instead, they have unified themselves under different classes of people. And now we're using the world standard to dictate what the church looks like. Can you see how this is falling apart? And yet, we still will try to say, okay, we'll make this work. No, it won't work. We need to reject the model altogether. And finally, one more thing. Division is usually the consequence, as Paul says, false brethren that are looking for significance. Let's look into 1 Corinthians 11. And I'm not trying to say that everyone that has been caught into it was looking for significance. Maybe they just might be a victim of someone looking for significance. But certainly when you read the stories, when we have broken ourselves off into different denominations or different sects of Christianity, it usually was a story of at least one person who was looking for significance. 1 Corinthians 11, and you know the story, they've already grouped themselves into different people that have baptized them. And he brings this up again when they take the Lord's Supper, because they're taking the Lord's Supper in groups. In verse 17, he says, "Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you have come together not for the better, but for the worse. For the first of all, when you have come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part, I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you." That's the reason. That's the reason why they've split themselves into factions, is so there are certain people that can receive that recognition. And I think it works kind of like this. And I know the world isn't going to exist in real life, but in a magical world where there are no sects and there are no denominations, and every person that claims to believe in Jesus is just a member of the universal church, really the way that God designed it, who is going to receive all the glory from that community of people? Jesus is. He's the only person we're going to know, right? And really, where do all these people come from? Well, they came from Jesus. What do you believe? I believe what Jesus taught, right? Oh, how do you feel about this? I feel about it however Jesus feels about it. There's not going to be a lot of conversations about our differences. And I know this is a fairy tale world, but we would all give Jesus all the credit and the glory. But in the world we live in, who gets all the credit and the glory? Well, it's the different men that have created their own different factions. And when people ask you what denomination you are, 9 times out of 10, the name we give is the name of a man. Well, I follow this person. Well, who's gained the significance? It's not Jesus. So ultimately, why would I ever want to be a part of something like this? I don't want to be a part of factions that find people significance. I just want to be part of the universal church that gives God all the glory. And that's why I don't think these things have ever worked. And I'm not looking for them to work in the future. In conclusion, the way I think we can look at this is basically we've just rejected the model. Man made a model. He said, this is the way the universal church looks like. And all the point we want to come across is that we as Christians have rejected that model. And we believe that the only people that are going to be saved are people that are members of the universal church, which are the all saved everywhere for all time. Those are the people that are going to go to heaven, not people that are affiliated with some certain denomination. That has nothing to do with it at all. But I feel like we need to remember this. The end of James chapter 2, our reading there, what did he say about mercy? He said mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy is greater than judgment. Jason gave an analogy this morning of a group of people that heard something different that they had never heard before. And instead of saying, hey, I've never heard of that before, I would rather do this now, I was wrong. Instead, they tried to craft some kind of reasoning as to why they were actually right all along. And that's not very far-fetched from a lot of times the things that we do. We have such a hard time saying, hey, I was wrong in the past. I'm now right because I read it out of this book. I want to do what this book says. Then instead, we try to craft and string these random passages together that don't have anything to do with each other and make some kind of crazy argument that we were right all along. Is that the type of person that believes mercy triumphs over judgment? No. That's a person that thinks that judgment's better. Because now they've got some clever reason, like our lawyer here early in Acts, he's going to string together some crazy reason as to why he was right all along. That's a person who loves judgment. But if we're brethren, we're people that love mercy. And if I really believe in mercy, then what do I want to do now? Well, now I want to say, hey guys, a long time ago, I believed these things and I was wrong about those things. And you know what? That's okay because I have a merciful God. And I've gotten God's mercy on those things, and now I'm living for him. Is that a person that believes mercy triumphs over judgment? Yeah, the person that believes in mercy triumphs over judgment has no problem saying, I was wrong. I was wrong about that. And I want to do what's right now that I've read it out of his book. That's a person that can truly be part of the universal church. If there's anyone here that wants to be part of the universal church tonight or needs the prayers of this particular congregation, we would love to do that for you. If you'll come forward as we